Why is studying ethics important? A 2012 study by Ernst & Young looking at executives showed that 40% of them felt that Why is studying ethics important? A study in 2012 by Ernst & Young looked at how executives feel about bribery and corruption. About 40% of them felt that bribery and corruption are common in their countries. Almost a quarter of them said that bribery and corruption have increased. Another 15% of them would actually take cash payments in the form of bribery. Now let's look at ethics in the law. Ethics can be defined as the values an individual uses to interpret whether actions or behavior are considered acceptable or appropriate. In contrast, the law codifies or socially regulates what will be allowed or enforced, whether that is at the national level, state level, or local level. How do ethics and the law intersect? Well, an action can be both ethical and legal. An action can be both unethical and illegal. However, the confounding situations are when an action is ethical but legal, or an action is unethical or legal. What should be done in those last two situations? Who cares about the difference between law and ethics? Well, in actual practice, it takes a long time for our laws and regulations to be revised and to catch up with what we consider to be right or wrong. Sometimes following the law is sufficient for ethical behavior, but other times the law can be seen as only minimally acceptable behavior. Some questions to ask, though, in considering the legality or ethics of a particular action revolve around considering whether the action is consistent with the overall basic duties of the individual or individual involved. Does that action acknowledge and respect the rights of all individuals who might be affected by that action? We also want to consider whether that action would be considered the best practice in that particular situation. The final question is, does that action match the overall entrenched beliefs of the individual? Shifting gears, now let's look at business ethics and the role of morals. Business ethics can be seen as the collective values of a business organization that can be used to evaluate where the behavior of the collective members of the organization are acceptable and appropriate. In looking at the role that morals play, individual morals have three components: the individual's principle, the individual's character, and the consequences of a particular action. There are three basic types of ethical thinking: descriptive, analytical, and normative. Descriptive ethics involves the presentation of facts related to the specific ethical actions of an individual or organization. It might be used when an observer wants to understand the course of events that generated the ethical issue. Analytical ethics looks at understanding the reason a course of action that might have had an ethical impact took place. Analytical ethics moves the discussion from how and why to asking why. Normative ethics involves a prescribed course of action that attempts to ensure that ethical behavior will be followed in the future. Normative ethics moves the discussion of the evaluation of an action from the past to the evaluation of the action to the future tense. This presents information on what should be done in the future rather than what was done in the past. Now we'll look at frameworks for ethics. The first is the Teleological Framework. This focuses on the results of the conduct of the individual. Ethical egoism is the concept that every individual should act or will act in a way to promote him or herself. If the net result would generate, on balance, positive rather than negative results, usually the individual moves in that direction. Utilitarianism looks at any action of an individual that provides the greatest good for the greatest number of people. It's based on the principle of utility, where people's actions add to the overall utility of the community. Sedgwick's dualism attempts to resolve the difference between whether the actions for oneself's benefit impact just the individual or others. This also argues that utilitarianism is a foundational concept for any ethical framework. The second framework is the Deontological Framework. This focuses on the duty or obligation of individuals in determining whether their actions are right or wrong. Existentialism believes that the only person who can determine right and wrong is the person making the decisions. Each individual determines his or her own actions and is ultimately responsible for the consequences of those actions. Contractarianism, also called the social contract theory, involves all individuals in the society agreeing to social contracts to be members within that society. The guiding principles revolve around fairness to everyone. Kant's ethics says individuals need the free will to make decisions that are considered rational. These then need to be converted into a universal will. Kantism is considered a dualism because it attempts to bridge the gap between the existentialist and the contractarian points of view. What are the guiding principles to support ethical actions? Well, they're basically very simple, and we're familiar with most of them. Fidelity, reparation, gratitude, justice, beneficence, self-improvement, and not doing harm to others. I think the only concept that might not be familiar to most of us is beneficence, and that's basically the doing of good actions, being active in terms of goodness and kindness. The Global Business Standards Codex captures the 8 major underlying principles in which ethical behavior can be interpreted and evaluated. These principles include the following. The fiduciary principle says each officer of a company has the legal fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of the stakeholders and other employees within the firm. The property principle is based on the belief that every individual should respect property as well as the rights of the owners of that property. The reliability principle is based on the belief that it is the employee's responsibility to honor the commitments he or she has made to the firm. The transparency principle says every individual should conduct business in a truthful and open manner. The dignity principle says each individual needs to respect the dignity of all individuals. The fairness principle believes stakeholders who have a vested interest in the firm should be treated fairly. The citizenship principle states that every employee should act as a responsible citizen in the community. And finally, the responsiveness principle says employees have the responsibility to respond to the requests for information about the operations from various stakeholders. What does the history of ethics tell us? Well, simply, ethics, or what is considered acceptable or appropriate behavior, has changed as people and culture have evolved. However, a few elements are generally consistent across those changes. So we'll look at the role of integrity and the role of trust. Integrity is defined as a firm's adherence to a code of especially moral values. It's based on employees' continuous efforts to balance their personal values with the requirements to perform their jobs effectively through their careers. This also involves what is referred to as the golden rule, where there is reciprocity between individuals and others. So how do we assess integrity? Well, there are several rules of thumb. The first is the publicity test. How would you feel if the action you're about to take was made public in the newspaper? The reciprocity tests look at the reciprocal relationship between the individual and others. Would somebody else in this same situation do what you're contemplating doing? The obituary test looks at how would you feel if this action that you took was part of your obituary. The trusted friend test obviously looks at whether your trusted friend would take that same action. And the universality test is would the general public do what you're about to do. What are the qualities of high integrity? Well, they involve possessing humility, maintaining a concern for the common good, being truthful and fulfilling your commitments, striving for fairness and taking responsibility for your actions, having respect for individuals, and celebrating the good fortune of others. It involves helping others to develop. And while we should reproach unjust acts, we should also be forgiving and extend ourselves to others. Why should companies be concerned about developing ethical managers? Well, managers who are ethical have the ability to establish their own rules pertaining to acceptable and unacceptable behaviors with the organizations. Ethical managers have developed a decision-making process that involves a realistic evaluation of ethical conduct, which is based on what is done in everyday actions. But if you read the current news, you might wonder if anyone is ethical. Unintentional, unethical behavior can take place due in part to the illusion of objectivity. We might think we're being objective, but are we? Unintentional, unethical behavior might develop along 4 different avenues. The first is having implicit prejudice. We may not even know that we're prejudiced towards a certain group or against a certain group. In-group favoritism might be that we show favoritism for people that we work with, to the exclusion of people outside that group. Do we claim credit for others' actions? Are there conflicts of interest? Are we recognizing those conflicts of interest? Some barriers to ethical behavior include the following. We might have ill-conceived gains. We might be blinded by our own motivations. We might have indirect blindness, where we don't even recognize we're being blind. We also might encounter something that's called the slippery slope. Once we start making unethical or inappropriate decisions, that may lead us to even more inappropriate and unethical behavior. And in looking at our outcomes, we may overvalue them, which may mean that we choose the wrong options to pursue at times. Unfortunately, there is a culture of cheating. A global study from 2016 discovered that the cheating culture is a worldwide phenomenon. Cheating occurred regardless of the level of corruption within a particular country. Overt corruption within countries leads to more corruption by the citizens of those countries. And in this study, there were gender differences. Female respondents were less likely to support cheating behavior compared to the male respondents. This chart demonstrates that there are generational differences in what people consider right or wrong, or acceptable and unacceptable. What's important for all of us to recognize is that we will confront some of these generational differences as we manage people from generations different from our own. However, it is important to recognize that individuals are still individuals, and we need to get to know them to understand who they are and what they value. So what's the role of trust in all this? Trust is an important component in the ability for cooperation to be supported throughout the organization. Trust allows employees to believe that he or she will be able to blow the whistle or speak out about other employees who are performing unethical acts, and they'll be able to do this without prejudice or fear of retaliation. Well, I hope this first module has given you a sense of where we will be going in this course. I look forward to working with you in the future modules.